if they want to.
And welcome to Let 'em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and we have a pretty interesting show for you tonight. We're going to learn about fracking. We're going to learn about uranium mining. We're going to learn about coal exploitation, of all places, in the Navajo Indian Reservation and in the area called the Four Corners, which is on the map behind me, where Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico and Arizona come together. And my guest, welcome to the show, Leona Morgan, who is an activist with, say the name of the website again, Diné.
Diné No Nukes.
Diné No Nukes, okay. And Diné No Nukes. Okay, we're going to put it up in a minute for people to see, so they'll be able to get it. Diné, D-I-N-E, no nukes.org, right?
Correct.
Okay, great. And so we're going to be talking about the uranium miners. We're going to be talking about coal mining. We're going to talk about fracking. We're going to talk about the legacy. We've just had a wonderful conversation even before we started about the legacy of World War II and the Manhattan Project, which is in New Mexico as well as in Washington State and Tennessee and many other places around the country, and what people are doing about it, what they plan to do about it, and some historical facts about the Navajo people that are going to be fascinating and are tied in to a walk which has begun today, and we're going to hear more about that. As a matter of fact, why don't we start, Leona, by telling us about today's walk, where that walk is happening, how far it's going, where it's going to, and why it's happening.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Paul, for having me on the show. My name is Leona, and just to introduce myself,
Sure.
My clans, traditionally we say our mother's clan, and that's how we learn who our relatives are. So I'm going to do that right now.
Okay.
Yate she Leona Morgan yinishia torij ini nishlit tana bisni bashichin kia ani dashiche. So that's my identity, I guess, as a Diné woman. And Diné is basically the way we call ourselves traditionally as people. Diné is the word for people, man, and also our culture. Mm-hmm. Navajo is actually the colonizer's word for our people. So that is the Navajo Nation, the Navajo government, jurisdiction, and so that's the difference. So Diné No Nukes, we're hoping to do some education using the name Diné because our land has been stolen. I think people are still learning this, that the colonization of the United States was a very historically traumatic event for all Indigenous people. So as Diné people, we're very fortunate. We have a huge landmass. So you can see on the map here.
Yes.
This is about the size. This is about the size of West Virginia here.
Right. Wow.
So right here, this is the
Thousands
Eastern
of square
Agency.
miles. Right.
Mm-hmm. So
Okay.
the Navajo Nation. On the Arizona side, the Navajo Nation is basically a mixture. I mean, on the Arizona side, the Navajo Nation is one contiguous landmass, except for Hopi. So Hopi is an island within the Navajo Nation, and then we have this little island right there.
I see it.
That's also Navajo Nation.
Okay.
But in Arizona and Utah, our Navajo law is sound, and it is usually respected by the state and the federal. But on the eastern side, on this side, we have what's called a checkerboard area. Mm-hmm. So this whole area is a mixture of state, federal, and private land. Mm-hmm. And then when you go further into the different types of federal, BLM, and
Bureau of Land Management.
Bureau of Land Management, and some of the areas are also called allotments. So the Dawes Act that was created in the 1880s was a form of divide and conquer.
Sure.
The Dawes Act created a lot of what's called Indian allotments. And again, we don't call ourselves Indian. That's a term of the American government. So as Indigenous people, we had this entire, the entire Navajo Nation that you see here. I'm sorry.
We can see it now. It's fine, beautiful.
That is not the entire land mass that we traditionally held. Our traditional land holdings were within the 4 sacred mountains, and one of those mountains is actually in Colorado. So that entire land mass we call Diné.
Okay.
And so today, the walk is beginning on January 6th, because this was one of the days in history that is very important to understand what happened to our people, known as the Long Walk.
Right.
So the walk is kind of a reenactment
That was
of that.
perpetrated by Kit Carson, who, like every kid in America grows up here, put on buckskins, at least my age, and ran around with a plastic gun making believe they were Kit Carson. We thinking he was a great hero and a great American. But in fact, there was a negative side to Mr. Carson, which I've only recently learned.
Oh, okay.
Well, I did know, recently, in the last few years, but, I didn't realize his specific role. And tell us about what happened.
Sure. Back in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, the United States, beginning earlier than that, the United States had colonized many of the tribes in the eastern part of the country. Mm-hmm. And so when they were moving westward, they tried to take the Diné people and move us out of our land and to basically separate us from our traditional places that are important, such as sacred. We call them sacred sites, like I mentioned, the Four Mountains. Mm-hmm. These places are very important to Diné people. The elements that are there, water, the air, the wind, and the fire, which is the sun. So when you remove indigenous people from these traditional land holdings, it changes and alters their worldview forever. Yeah. And so our people, we were moved for 4 years from Navajo Nation area. We call it Diné, and we were moved to over here in New Mexico. It's off the map, but to a place called Bosque Redondo. And in Navajo, in Diné, we call it Huelde, and it was a place of great suffering. The U.S. Army, Kit Carson at the lead. Basically, it was it was the United States. Yeah. So Kit Carson was just one of many, many men who did these horrible atrocities as a form of patriotism or whatever, manifest destiny. So for 4 years, our people lived in an army area, and we were given rations, white flour, potatoes, lard, and these were types of foods today that we know are severe forms of things that cause diabetes and other health problems. Our traditional foods would have been like corn, beans, squash, and then later we did also start to eat sheep. Mm-hmm. So we consume mutton and that kind of thing. So when we were in Bosque Redondo for 4 years, the United States Army couldn't keep up the payments to their soldiers, and then they couldn't keep feeding us. It was just a huge. So like everything today, we go into the uranium mining issue. Everything is based on money, and so because they couldn't afford to keep us there, we were lucky enough that we held out, and the ones who did survive, they made the long journey home.
I see. And
so that we call the long walk, and it's a very significant thing because as indigenous people who were forcibly removed from our lands, we're very fortunate that we still today, we returned and we're still indigenous. There's a lot of natives who are in Oklahoma and they're no longer indigenous, and it's an atrocity. But so this area, the reason I'm bringing up this history is the walk that we're talking about.
Besides, it's fascinating, and everybody in America should know it.
Right.
You call yourself an American, how can you not know this history? And that's why you have all the time you want to talk about it. But go ahead.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And it's really important that we do talk about it because people think, that's history, and you guys need to get over it. You're never going to get your land back. We hear people talk about things that, like assumptions that indigenous people don't pay taxes, or that we have special rights, and we're dual citizens. We have the same rights as U.S. citizens, but we also have, we do have some rights from our tribal nations if we are lucky enough to be federally recognized. So there's a lot of non-recognized tribes that, they don't have, if they're not federally recognized, they don't have land, they don't have a reservation, and many of the benefits from the stealing of the theft of our country. So basically today I wanted to talk to you about the walk and why it's so important.
Sure. And so it started today, and the walk is now, I saw 200 miles?
Yes, I think in total it will be more than that. I know when they were planning it, they were talking about 300 miles.
In the middle of winter, and it's cold there like here too, similarly cold,
right.
high up in the altitude, and so that's a tough walk. It was a tough walk 150 years ago, and it's a tough walk today.
Many people died. Many
Hopefully that won't happen
children.
this time. They look like a pretty athletic bunch who are making the walk this time.
There are a lot of young people who have a
Yeah.
lot of energy and
Sure.
a spirit, and unfortunately, I am not with them. I'm here.
Or you would have made the walk as well?
You know, that's a good question. It is like you said, it is winter, and the work I have to do, it's
It's in a warm place. Like
well,
here.
actually, my apartment's pretty cold as
Right.
as
In
an
Albuquerque,
activist.
right? That's where
I
you
live
live.
in Albuquerque, and,
Right,
and
right.
you know.
We're speaking with Leona Morgan, who is a Diné or Navajo activist, and she is telling us a fascinating story of the history of the Navajo people. Many probably Americans who don't know anything about Navajo people, it's because they saw those movies about the Navajo code talkers who used their language as a code during World War II, and which is several movies have been made about, and you can look it up on Wikipedia and all those kind of things. But there's a lot more to it.
Oh
than
yeah,
that.
there's
That was a
so
small-
much.
Yeah.
One of the interesting facts when you bring up World War II, it's estimated that about half of the uranium that was used for the bombs of World War II were taken from one of our sacred mountains in New Mexico, about right here.
Yeah.
No, over here.
Okay, I'll believe
it's
you.
not.
That's fine.
It's not on within the Navajo Nation, and so that's one of the reasons why explaining Diné, that is the area of concern for Diné no nukes. We're not just concerned about state and these boundaries.
So during the Manhattan Project, did this secretive military guys just start showing up and hiring people to mine and dig things they didn't even know what they were digging and things like that? I mean, that's how it was in some of the other locations.
Well, I wasn't alive back then,
But
so
you might
I
have heard
can't.
stories,
I've
right?
heard so many stories, and
Yeah.
pretty much as Indigenous people, our culture has been orally passed on. So I've heard many stories about the types of operations that were done, the treatment of workers, and so basically with the mining that occurred before the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, none of that mining before 1969 was licensed or regulated or permitted the way we permit things today.
The days
with
the old uranium prospector who could just go out, find their own uranium with a Geiger counter, dig it up, and bring it in.
Yeah, so they still used this law called the Mining Law of 1872, and that was created as a form of resource colonization. So in 1872, this mining law was basically to encourage westward expansion, manifest destiny, and it was for old types of mining with like pickaxe and a shovel, and what you had to do is basically claim a stake in the ground and prove to this was only on public lands. So if you could prove that you can extract certain types of hard rock minerals, uranium being one of them, you could basically pay the federal government less than $10 a year to do this type of mining on public lands. And this law is still being used today by big multi-billion, multinational
Still, they haven't changed this law?
No. So it is being used on public lands. That means on Mount Taylor, which is it's on National Forest Service land.
Do they just drive around in a truck and look for uranium outcrops or outcrops of other minerals?
Well, the mining of the past, from the 1940s to the 60s, there was a huge boom. And so basically all of the mining from the past they've identified already from exploratory drilling where there is uranium ore. It's not like you can see the outcrop. You have to do a lot of drilling. And so today, in certain places, there's still uncapped wells. And so I heard a story, a young woman said when they're riding their horses, they have to go slow. They can't gallop because the horse his foot might slip into a hole, and then they injure the horse.
That would be terrible.
So it would be very terrible if people walk into abandoned mines, drink contaminated water, and build their houses with these things, and that's all.
So there was no
all
cleanup.
those things have
It's the
happened.
same thing that happened at Hanford, at Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos. Just all out. Nobody cared about the environmental effect of what they were doing.
Well, again, this was all pre-NEPA. So basically, anything that happened before the Clean Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and I'm sure even the Clean Air Act didn't have radon standards at that time. But before these laws were passed, all of the mining that was done was basically the federal government. They hired companies to go in, and they used conventional methods, meaning they took the ore out of the ground, they trucked it to a mill, then they crushed it and they grinded it, and then they would use a lot of water and electricity from coal-fired power plants to produce yellow cake.
Right.
And
So in
then-
order to make nuclear fuel, you needed to burn a lot of coal to make electricity.
and the transportation, and so basically every step of the nuclear fuel chain is very intensive in its use of water, electricity, back in the legacy, the mining that happened, that boom that occurred, there was a lot of miners, there were a lot of workers, so there were people that actually, their health didn't benefit, but there was also this economic boom.
Sure.
Today, that's not the same because they use different methods such as ISL. They use the most cost-effective methods that have the least amount of workers, such as, the fracking.
Right. Okay, great. Interesting. We'll get into that in a minute. But this is all very interesting. So this is the situation that we're, and by the way, what I'm dropping on the ground are these cool, tell us a little bit about these symbols here. This is an interesting one. What is this? Radiation, not in my water, and there's a sheep there.
Right.
And this one here, what is the word here? This is in the Diné language.
Right. So this sticker here says "Hletso doda." So this word here in our language, it means uranium, and so we have the word for uranium, even though we didn't have a word for money, or capitalism, or colonization, or radiation, and this word means no. And so the reason why we have a sheep, so this is basically saying no to uranium mining. This image is more about the issue of contamination from the world's largest uranium tailings spill in 1979 here in Churchrock, right there.
I see it.
There was the world's largest uranium spill took place on July 16, 1979, just 3 months after 3 Mile Island. And that spill went from here all the way into Arizona. So if you could see behind me, it's basically
we
goes
see,
from
we
here.
get the idea. We can see on the top where it goes from New Mexico across to Arizona along the top above your head, New Mexico all the way to Arizona. So you can see this is a very large area, hundreds of miles. Right?
It was about 100 miles, 96 million gallons of liquid contaminated waste broke from a mill. They were storing their liquid waste in an earthen dam. The dam broke.
And that's just the waste that comes from uranium mining. This is the tremendous wasteful, at least in uranium mining.
Well, this one was from the mill.
From the mill, okay.
So the mine waste is
I
more
see.
dry tailings, and there's piles of tailings all over the United States West. There's over 500 contaminated, abandoned uranium mine sites on Navajo Nation alone. That's what this map is. So
That's
over
what all
500.
those red dots are.
Those are the most contaminated areas, yes. There's over 500, and they're called mine lands. But if you count each individual site, it could be as many as 2,000. But in the United States west of the Mississippi, there are over 10,000 abandoned uranium mines.
What is this uranium used for? Was it mostly used in weapons construction, or was it used for nuclear power plants? What was it used for?
Well, before the dawn of nuclear power, it was all to fuel the Cold War. So all of this was for weapons, so for destruction of life. And so this is a symbol of, it says radiation not in my water. So this says several things, and it's basically talking about the contamination from the old mining, which was all for the bombs. That we call legacy mining, and the reason why it's so different is because it happened before the NEPA Act, Clean Drinking Water Act, and so basically they made a huge mess, and there was no laws saying you have to clean that up to pre-mining background radiation levels. So there was a huge mess. The United States government was the only purchaser after the nuclear power. Dawn of nuclear power, then it went to private companies.
For a period of time after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from before Hiroshima and Nagasaki until into the middle of the Cold War, the United States government owned all uranium. So if whoever privately dug it up, you had to give it to the government, and it belonged to them. You were digging it for them and giving it to them. When they decided to create the nuclear power industry, then they changed the law and allowed people and companies to privately own uranium so they could keep it on site and use it however they saw fit.
Right, and then after that was about the 70s, and then the Environmental Protection Agency was formed, and then things were a little bit different. They had to do different types of permits, and they had to report, and there's so many.
Is there as much uranium mining today as there was in those days?
That's a good question. Not in the United States, but in other parts of the world, yeah.
So this is mostly a remediation problem on the Diné or Navajo lands.
Currently, today, our Navajo Nation government is working with the United States to do cleanup, and they're making these 5-year plans for the mess they made in 70
What do you think of
years'
that?
time.
Do you think that this is real, or is this, well, you hear from people in Hanford and different places who think the cleanup's even worse than what they did in the first place?
That's a very good question. You know, we don't want 500 contaminated nuclear waste sites on Navajo, and we don't want 500 parks that were created from these nuclear facilities and
as an excuse
places.
Never to go there ever,
Right. And so,
which is cheaper than cleaning it up.
Correct. And so we in the Navajo Nation, we're in the middle of a drought, and so one of the hugest issues that we have is water. And so when the Navajo Nation and the US EPA are doing the cleanup, they're more concerned about covering tailings, dry tailings from blowing around.
Because they get so dry, they can the dust can blow in the air, and those are cancer-causing chemicals and radiation in that dust.
Oh yes, definitely, for sure. If you breathe in a particle, even it's invisible.
What are the lung cancer problems? I mean, it's an uptick, right? Can you really see cancer increases in Navajo land, or is that an issue?
The hospital staffs in the area do say there has been a rise. And so, like earlier, I was about to mention that the cleanup that started is mostly they're taking down structures, they're covering waste piles, but they have not done much remediation of groundwater. And so what the companies have done is they have contaminated vast amounts of groundwater, and so the United States EPA and the other agencies basically say, well, the groundwater is so contaminated that the people can't drink it, and the Navajo it's called NTUA.
Yeah.
It's our utilities services,
Yeah, sure.
Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. They basically shut down a lot of the wells in the areas where the water was contaminated. So currently we do not use the groundwater. It's piped in from another location, which is also a ploy because in New Mexico, if you don't use your water rights, you lose them. So now the companies and the government are saying, well, the water's so contaminated, they don't use it anyways. Go ahead, you can resume mining. So on Navajo Nation, since 2005, we've had a law against uranium mining. There's no uranium mining on Navajo. But in New Mexico, in the checkerboard area, on allotments, there's little holes, places here and there, tiny sections of land that are not under Navajo jurisdiction. So those are places the companies target, and then they can go down into the earth. And then also it's a split estate. So that's where the fracking issue comes in, because there's a fracking boom in this area now.
Right. And we've talked about fracking. Now we're shifting from uranium mining to natural gas exploration in the same area. As the modern uranium has faded into the past, we're dealing now with cleanup and the effect of people who are still alive from those days. And now the new boom, gold rush. This is for natural gas.
And the issue here is in this area, we see all these red dots. That means there's uranium there. And so the fracking boom is right there. So if they're fracking and the Mancos shale here, it has uranium. There's uranium in that layer of shale. So once they frack it, the radiation releases are similar to uranium mining. And so even though we don't have uranium mining,
and
we're having these issues.
We've discussed that before. It's basically putting an explosive down in a deep well to frack or to crack the soil to bring out the trapped natural gas and everything else like radon and other radioactive substances into our environment where it shouldn't be.
Right. And so that's one of the major issues that the group of young people are raising. So this morning they started this walk to honor our ancestors.
How can people know more about this and find out more about it?
Right now there is a Facebook website, and I should have given that to.
But we should call it the title they can search is the long walk.
The Journey for Existence.
The Journey for Existence. Okay, so the Journey for Existence. You can search it on Facebook. You can search it on the internet. There's websites, and you can learn more about this walk that's going on right now to address and popularize the issues we're discussing. What other websites? We've been putting a website up on the screen, and we can put it up again, and people can go to that website for more information as well, right?
Sure. You can also look at Indian Country Today, did a pretty good article.
Okay, the newspaper Indian Country Today and a website, which is excellent. I like them on Facebook and get their stuff every day, and you can learn a lot about this kind of stuff, so very good. Okay, we have a few more minutes. What I wanted to do, I guess, in the last few minutes is talk about exactly what folks are going to try and do to stop, because it seems like, we were lucky we got a ban against fracking in New York State, but right over the border, and it's just an artificial line in Pennsylvania, it's wild. What can you really stop the fracking from happening in New Mexico?
Well, there was
There's
a ban.
so much gas there.
There was a ban that was passed in Mota County, which is on the other side of the state. So this is the northwestern part of New Mexico. On the northeastern part over here, there was a legislation, a city, a county ordinance that was passed.
Now I hear that there was a story just in the paper the other day that the companies are hitting back with lawsuits and trying to fight these communities when they try and try and spend them into the dirt, basically.
Well, of course they'll do whatever they can to try to extract their profit that they believe is theirs. And as Indigenous people, we don't believe that anybody owns the land or the water or the minerals. And so I'm gonna talk about something that the company did, which wasn't such the same type of backlash, but one of the strategies that they used against our people occurred just this past year, and there was a huge fight to overturn what the companies had done, and so I wanted to share that with you.
Go for it. Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
Okay, great. So basically, there was a uranium company in 1989 who had received all of the permits necessary to do what's called In Situ Leach mining, and this is Uranium Resources Incorporated. URI. They started a project called the Crownpoint project, where they had intended to mine uranium here using this ISL method, which is very similar to fracking, and then drive it to Crownpoint, which is about right here, where they have actually a central processing plant. The central processing plant isn't quite developed yet, and this is a poor company, so we learned that they probably will never develop the processing plant, but the mining site here, what they could do is take that uranium to their processing plant in South Texas. So when we, as Navajo Nation, the government passed what's called the Diné Natural Resources Protection Act, we call it the DNRPA, that is the Navajo Nation law that says there will be no more uranium mining. And that law basically says no mining until all of the legacy is cleaned up. So that means we need to do the remediation, the cleanup, and all of the different things that go with that. And that is very, at the very beginning stages. Like I said, we've only completed one 5-year plan. The government is getting started to do the next 5-year plan. But okay, so basically the URI company, I guess in retaliation, in 2005, we passed a law, and they had been going to court. In 2010, the court basically sided with the company, and then we kept fighting it, but they worked with the tribe to get a tribal law passed, and it wasn't a lawsuit, so we had our own leaders working with the company, and we had to fight our own leaders. On July 22nd this year, a group of us had successfully done so to reverse that legislation.
Thank you very much, Leona Morgan. Appreciate it. Thank you. See you next week.